is what are we voting for on June 9th? And just as a step back, many of you have received your absentee ballot. If you haven't, you should be in the next day or two. The absentee ballots are to be completed and then sealed in the self-stamped envelope and returned to the district. Must be returned by June 9th, 5 p.m., at which time they will be opened and counted. So the question is, what are we voting for this year? You're voting for two specific items related to the budget. You're approving the spending plan of $54.1 million, which we will review with you tonight. You're also voting to approve the purchase of 3 large buses and 1 large handicapped wheelchair accessible bus for a total cost of $509,477. And as we have explained in the past, with these costs, these are 80% plus aided by New York State. They are a very, very good bargain for us. Again, we'll explain that later on. So these are the 2 items that you're voting for on the absentee ballot, plus the election of 2 board seats that are currently open. And more information is in our budget newsletter and website regarding that. But tonight we're focusing strictly on the budget. So over the course of the last almost 6 months, we have been using these 3 principles when we decided on what needed to be done and the process we were going to use. And I want to just pause to review these because they're incredibly important in light of what we've had to do with this current budget and with our proposed budget. We want to deliver a premier education that our community can afford and will support, and that's critical because the premier education requires resources. And in a shrinking revenue scenario that we're currently in, you have to evaluate and reallocate resources to try and deliver that premier education. It's not easy. However, we also have to make sure that the community will support it and can afford it. Number 2, we want to provide a well-rounded educational program that meets all students' needs. We look at the whole child, and we look at all children, from a 4- and a 5-year-old all the way up to an 18-, 19-year-old, and everyone in between. So we are looking to keep an entire program intact versus specific particular areas. We want to make sure that we can provide as much of everything that we can. And then the last thing, and this is probably the most critical, especially tonight when we're talking about a budget, we need to make sure that the district is healthy and that we can sustain the programming. And as you're going to see later on, that is very, very difficult to do in today's climate. So these are our guiding principles. And then our objectives, and we'll start getting right into the meat of the proposal. First of all, we had, as I said, our guiding principles were pretty self-explanatory, but the real objectives of this year are these 4. Number 1, we have a structural deficit. Structural deficit is when you have repeated imbalances between expenditures and revenue. And so if it was a structural surplus, then we would be having a completely different conversation. But because expenditures exceed revenue and will exceed revenue over the next several years, at least based on projections, we have to address that every time it rears its head. So number 1, we want to address the structural deficit. Number 2, we want to keep all student programs intact. The goal for this year was not to eliminate an entire program, but to keep it intact. And so go back to the K-12 model. You may not have everything you had or wanted, but as long as you have something and it's still very high quality, we consider that important and success. Number 3, we want to stay within our tax levy limit, which is what New York State dictates through formula process. This year it's 1.94%. That is the limit. And then 4, we want to maintain healthy fund balance and reserve levels. And there's nothing any more obvious of why that's important than what we're dealing with right now with COVID-19 and the potential loss of state aid. So you have to have a savings account in order to deal with economic uncertainty. So these were our objectives going into 2021 budget. So these are the final recommendations that we've shared with the Board of Education, and now we're sharing to all of you as our public community guests. Recommendation number 1, we want to address a structural deficit through the reduction of expenditures. As I said before, the structural deficit is when expenditures exceed revenue. Therefore, it's not about finding more revenue as much as it's aligning your expenditures with what revenue you have. So we have done that this year, and that spending plan is $54.1 million. It's accomplished, however, through the reductions of those items, and I'll get into more details later on. So that's recommendation number one. Recommendation number two, pretty much the same, and with regards to the details, but we want to reduce reserve use in anticipation of potential state aid reductions in 2021 and beyond. It has been very public that New York State was in a budget deficit, and it has only exploded as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Therefore, we can expect less state aid and potentially less for several years, not only based on the state economy, but also based on the overall global national economy that's going to have an impact on incomes and wages and everything that goes along with that. So this is a tricky time to be figuring out what the future looks like, so we need to have that additional reserve in our pockets in the event we need to use it to plug some holes. So that is a recommendation, and part of this budget is to keep some money in reserve as well. So on June 23rd, at our first budget workshop, and just to highlight what a structural deficit looks like, you can see the numbers. This is actually a pretty important chart. So we predict out what our tax levy is likely to be, what our state aid, that's what foundation aid represents, what that's likely to be, and then we have our beginning fund balance. And our fund balance is basically it's our cash on hand, it's our savings account, our checking account, it's money that we have accessible to use. So when you look underneath the beginning fund balance and you see operating surplus or deficit, those numbers in red in parentheses are the structural deficit that we're mentioning. So as you look out over 21, 22, 23, 24, based on the top two numbers, the tax levy being relatively flat and foundation aid, and that's state aid, so we're expecting that number to actually at best be zero, hopefully not too far of a negative, then you can see that structural imbalance is simply going to explode potentially over the next couple of years. So again, if you look at the bottom, projected annual average expenditures increases are 3.6, while average revenues projected to be 2. That's a formula for a structural imbalance, and that's what we're trying to alleviate and address this year. So many people ask, so why are we here? How did this happen? It seems like we're constantly making reductions, and quite honestly, we have. And so I'll get to that specifically, but right now, 96% of our revenue, 96 cents of every dollar comes from either the state or through the local community that we ask each year. Neither of those have kept pace with our expenditures. And I know some people say, well, then spend what you have. Well, when expenditures are exploding, and I'll go over specific areas, above and beyond what you predict, it puts you in a circumstance where you have to make those reductions in order to simply balance your budget. And there are two areas in particular that has happened, and we'll explain that. Number two, 2 months ago, we wouldn't have even had this on here, but obviously based on what's happened since March 11th, we know that New York State is going to be impacted. We know that schools are going to be impacted. The hope is that Maine-Endwell is impacted as least amount as possible. But we expect a reduction in state aid. We're almost guaranteeing it. Now, 3 and 4, when people ask, so where is the growth in our expenditure lines? The two largest areas have been health insurance costs, which we're going to show you quite a bit of data on, and special education costs. And special education costs are legal, obligated, contractual, if you will, costs that we have to provide, and health insurance too, based on who is currently on the plan, who's using the plan. It's almost impossible to predict when someone's going to be sick or someone has to use that, but based on what we know right now, those are the two areas that we know are growing expenditure-wise, and so we are obviously trying to address that. Now, I use number 5 as a history lesson because we've done this now since really 2012, and probably earlier than that, but that was the first year that I started my first budget. we've made reductions in all of those years simply to have a savings account, believe it or not, and to offset large increases, especially over the last couple of years in special ed and health insurance. So when you have large unanticipated costs that are well above your projected expectations, you have to make tough decisions to balance your budget. Or you can use all of your savings account and then have nothing for an emergency or for unexpected costs, and now you're even in a doubly issue to deal with. So having those savings accounts are just as important as trying to make sure that you keep all of your programming intact and that you're providing that premier education. So you can't provide a premier education unless you have fiscal stability and sustainability, and that's what we've been trying to accomplish over the last 9 years. And it's difficult and it's challenging, and I'm going to explain a little bit further the costs that are making it really challenging. So I want to focus on health insurance because this is an area that many people recognize what it is, but they don't necessarily always look at the fine details. And so I just want to point, there's a couple layers here, and I don't want to go into every nook and cranny. We'll certainly ask or answer any questions you have, but I think you can see from 14-15, which we're using as our baseline, to where we are today, it's a sizable increase in health insurance costs. And I can say that from 14-15 to 2021, staffing levels are probably around the same. We may have 5 to 8 more employees in 2021 than we did in 14-15, but it's close. So it isn't just because we've added all these additional people and now they're using health insurance. It's because health insurance and those that have used it or are using it has blown up so much. So I think this is just a good reference point when we say to people, health insurance has gone up exorbitantly. And many times people will say, so change your plan, have people pay more, remove certain aspects of it. Health insurance is 100% contractually negotiated, and you're obligated to negotiate it. There is no unilateral decision-making a district can make. We could, and then we could face legal issues if we go against the contract or we reduce benefits arbitrarily. So health insurance is one area that we are working very hard to address, but realize that it's a negotiated expenditure, not something that we can just make a unilateral decision on. So I think when you look at that number, and then this to me is what stands out, or at least I hope it does, and I added 13-14 in here just as a little one extra year from a historical baseline, but it pretty much tells the same story. In 14-15, 13-14, 14-15, we were spending about 16, 17 cents a dollar on health insurance. In 2021, and really over the last 3 years, we're spending around 21, almost 22 cents of every dollar. That's a large increase, and that eats up, pushes out, crowds out, whatever term you want to call it, your ability to spend money elsewhere. When you have to spend money on health insurance and you have to pay that bill, that's money that can't be spent elsewhere. And I think that's probably the most important piece of what's the significance of health insurance cost to the district. It bumps out your ability to spend money elsewhere. So we have been looking at this over the last 3 years, and actually very closely, I'd say over the last 9 years, but specifically we had a health insurance task force that was led by the Assistant Superintendent, Jeff Lamoureux, and board members and community members and staff and bargaining units, and the entire group met for many nights, came up with a comprehensive, I think it's a 17-page report, and these were the main findings that came out of this report, this stakeholder task force. And I note these on here, not that I'm going to read them to you, but these are the areas that we have been trying to negotiate, and I put the word negotiate under before the number for each one to make sure that it's obvious that that is a negotiated point, not something that can just be made. And also I want to note, if you want to see that entire task force finding, you can go to our website and find that and read it. It's very, very informative. But we have not made great gains on these recommendations. And again, not to say that I'm not throwing any particular group or staff under the bus. It's simply not as easy to change negotiated items as one may think. I will say we are having very good conversations regarding the need, and I believe our staff recognizes the need, and I'm hopeful. I think our assistant superintendent and our board is hopeful that we will get to where we need to quickly, because that percentage from 16% to 21% and growing is just going to continue to eat up our ability to spend and invest elsewhere. So this is an area that we are working on. We're working hard, but it takes time. And unfortunately, we do not have the luxury of time right now, knowing that we're up against some pretty significant financial issues. So the strategies to reduce the deficit, and we have been using these over the last 4 months. We've been mentioning how we're going to address this. Again, I don't need to read them to you, but at the end of the day, it's all about reducing your expenditures. And we try to reallocate where we can, but realistically, when you're addressing a $1.6 million structural deficit, you need to make significant reductions. And again, you're going to see exactly how significant those are. So first things first, I want to talk about staff reductions. So total, and I'll break these out for you, total staff reductions for the year for 2021 will be 20.4, and that 0.4 is a part-time position. So if anyone's asking how is that possible, it's a part-time position. But we have identified 13 instructional reductions and 7.4 non-instructional reductions for a total of 20.4, which is netting us a savings of 1.2. Now how that breaks out, there's actually 5 layoffs on the instructional side. And then there are 8 positions for a total of 13 that we're not filling. Now, we still have some decisions to make at the bottom. You see TBD. One of those 3 will not be filled, which is that 1 that adds up to finally to 8. We're going to evaluate the budget health to determine if we can fill those. But nonetheless, those are the positions that we are shrinking for 2021, again, based on our expenditures not aligning with our revenue. When you go to the non-instructional, we have 4 teacher aide positions that we will not be filling. We also have some retirements and some resignations. And so again, that 0.4, that's a part-time position. That's 3.4 total of 7.4. Now, we are filling 2 positions. We have a chemistry opening, which we need in order to provide the 3rd year of science at the high school level, which is chemistry. And also, we have a school nurse position that we must fill. So we are filling some positions, very few, but we try to not fill open positions. So where you see not filling, it's to eliminate the need to lay off. So someone retires, we don't fill the position, we reshuffle and reallocate resources to try to keep the programming as same as we can. And again, that's the balance we've tried to make with staffing. Now, other items, because there were other items that we are also reducing, and as they're listed out here, a lot of extra hours, some overtime, we had some professional development, we are eliminating a couple of sports teams, there are some stipend positions that will not be funded, some small equipment reductions, and then copy printing, which, again, we are working to be smarter with our paper use and ink use, especially now with the virtual climate having exploded. So at the end of the day, here's over $500,000 of reductions we're also using on top of the 1.2 for the staffing. So as of tonight, and this is the best information we have, we know the governor has said expect state aid to be reduced. We just don't know how much. But right now, this is our revenue picture for this year. Last year, we spent $53.5 million. This year, we're asking for $54.1. It's a little under $670,000 increase, or 1.25% year-to-year change. Now, I mentioned reserve use, and it's important to know that this is our current reserves, again, and what we're projecting to use. And we were going to use, if you look on the 4th column where it says proposed on March 26th, we were slated to use over almost $1.2 million in reserves. After the COVID-19 pandemic and the concern that using all of those savings would hurt us moving forward, we decided to make further reductions to allow us to have more money on reserve to deal with, and you'll note on the very far right column, available for mid-year cuts. We expect reductions in state aid without a savings account or checking book. We couldn't afford some of these positions or some of these programs. We'd have to make cuts mid-year. And so by having more money in reserves now, we can ward off having to make those reductions mid-year. At least we hope. That's our plan. So again, we do have reserves on hand for these unexpected expenses and or reductions in revenue. And then our total expenditure plan, again, it lines up with how much money we have coming in, at least for now, 1.25 year-to-year, $669,000 year-to-year increase. And you can note on here, if you look at BOCES, so I'm going to put right here, you see the BOCES line, went from 8.2 to 9 million to 873,000. Most of that is special ed costs. So when I mentioned special education costs going up, that's the brunt of that 873 increase. And then if you go down to health insurance, the 228,000 that increase from year to year, there's your second biggest item. So again, these are the areas that we struggle to balance. And just those two areas alone, 873,228 is over $1 million. So if our budget's growing at 669,000, those two items alone are well over what we're planning on spending year to year. So you have to make reductions elsewhere to make that work, and that's why we're making reductions.
Okay,
now
Jason,
I show this is just a again, a little bit of history and a little bit of perspective. So in 2013 and 14, we made significant reductions in order to balance the budget and have a savings account and put money in reserves. We were depleted. We were virtually depleted of reserves and fund balance in 13, 14. In 14, 15, 15, 16, and 16, 17, after building up our fund balance and reserves, we were able to make some incremental increases to our budget through hiring back additional staff. This also coincided with the state adding more money back in what they eliminated called the gap elimination adjustment, where they would take your state aid and they would eliminate right from the start a certain percentage that they then used to close their budget gap. It was called the gap elimination adjustment. They stopped taking money out of our state aid allotment, and so as that money came back on for us in the form of state aid, it was additional state aid. So 14, 15 to 16, 17, you see the growth in the budget. That's a direct result of more revenue coming in and us having a savings account and having reserves plentiful. Now, go from 17, 18 to the current. As state aid has slowly dropped and our costs have gone up in those two areas in particular, health insurance and special ed, we have had to make difficult decisions to simply have a balanced budget, but also to keep some money in reserves. We could absolutely blow through our reserves and fund balance and not make tough decisions. We're just going to push those bad decisions on to the next year or the next couple of years. So by having to make tough decisions, unfortunately, it seems routinely, it's keeping the district financially stable, but it's a difficult process to be in when you're dealing with student programming and obviously with staff and faculty that you're constantly having to make tough decisions. So this is just, I hope, somewhat of an explanation of when the revenue came back and we were healthy, we tried to make smart decisions. As the revenue has dried up and our expenditures have grown well above our revenue, we've had to make tough decisions. And that's the balancing act, unfortunately, that we and many school districts are in, with a tax cap and with heavy reliance on state aid. So our three-part budget, this is part of the budget hearing process that we are mandated to report. So there are three parts to our budget. There's the program budget, and this is all of, and you can see the items, it's 71 cents of every dollar we spend. This is all of your teaching, related service, special ed, computer, assisted instruction, all of your transportation, all of your athletics, co-curriculars. This is basically all of the student programming and faculty and staff that go with student programming. And that's why 71 cents of every dollar goes into that, because obviously, that's what our business is. Now, hopefully you'll know the biggest line in that entire group, and those are all, pretty large budget program lines, is employee benefits. So employee benefits, we actually spend more in employee benefits than we do in salaries, at least for the teaching group, where you see teacher regular school. So again, just something from a perspective standpoint of where we're spending our money. Now, we also have a capital budget line, and as you can see, these are pretty typical. The largest cost is our debt service. We've had to make improvements over the year, and every time we borrow money or we take money out of capital reserves to start capital projects, you have to pay it back. Now, what people don't understand typically is that we get corresponding aid called building aid from New York State that offsets most of that increase year to year. So yes, it's $7 million, but when you factor in building aid, it actually reduces that number significantly. So there is corresponding state aid that goes with that debt service. But again, that is a little under almost 20% of our total budget. And then our last program area is administrative. And so as you can see, these costs about 9.81%, a little under 10%. And this is all of your services to administer and operate the district, including your finance, all of your accounting, budget development, and then obviously your supervision in the buildings, and then obviously benefits for all those that are employed there as well. So our third recommendation is to stay at the tax levy limit of 1.94. We recently conducted a large survey, and that survey was to gauge community thought. I can say it, and I believe I speak for the board, we understood it was not a good time to ask, but we still wanted to let the community know that it's a problem. And in light of everything going on, we wanted to ask. Now, in hindsight, I think we all felt a little uncomfortable, but again, felt we still needed to ask the community. The community responded significantly, a lot of support, but not enough to where we felt it made sense to try to go over the 1.94. So we are asking for 1.94%, which is the levy limit, which requires 50.1 of voter approval. We are not asking for more than what the limit is, and again, you'll see the explanation there. We recognize this is not the right time to ask. Now, I know you've probably heard this for 9 to 10 years. The tax levy is it's not what you pay from your community that you live in. It's how much we're asking all of the communities and all of the homeowners that live in our district for. It's not always 2%, and with the levy limit, initially everyone said, well, it's 2%. It's not 2%. There's a formula that we use. Sometimes it's 2%, sometimes it's 8%, sometimes it's 6%. Sometimes it's a negative. But the bottom line is it's not 2%. It's whatever the formula drives it be. So when you look at our formula, and this is the formula that we have to provide to New York State, when you run all of the calculations, our tax levy increase that's allowable by New York State is 1.94%, or $473,981. That's how much we can ask the local community that's how much more we can ask the local community from last year. Now, over on the right, I think that's important. This is not an override. We're not asking, this is not 60% or greater. It requires a simple majority, and quite honestly, it's critical that we receive that $473,000. So a lot of times people ask us, well, what does that mean? So we use an average home in our community. So you figure Town of Union represents around 72% of our properties, Maine another 22% of our properties, and so we use the Town of Union, a home at the value to $100,000 in the Town of Union as an average. If you have no star, basic star, enhanced star, this is what you would pay. And then these are the savings, and then this is what that 1.94% would be for you on an annual basis. So it's about $56 for an average $100,000 home in the town union. It's $56 more a year. Now, if you look at different home valuations, again, this is just something to give you an idea of how much more that would cost. This is not a rate. This is not your tax bill. This is just telling you what that would look like. We have a pretty good idea of what it would look like cost-wise for you. And the cost per month is not to insult you. It's just to say that's what it would end up being, because I've had community members say, so what does that cost a month? And so that's just another way of seeing that. The fourth recommendation is for the board to maintain the allowable fund balance per the board policy 3910. Right now, that is money that's unassigned, but it allows, it's discretionary to a certain degree. It allows you to fill holes and to offset revenue reductions, and our goal is to keep that or as close to 4% as we possibly can. So that is our fourth recommendation. And then our fifth recommendation and final recommendation for the night is to continue with the bus replacement plan. We are requesting 4 buses, and this allows us to keep our fleet at a very safe cost structure so that we don't have 5 to 10 buses all coming out of warranty or sustaining large costs due to maintain them. If we keep our fleet relatively new and we rotate them through, then it's cost effective. It's also heavily aided by New York State, and we even trade in our buses that have surplus value or have additional value, I should say. And so we take that cost of those buses and then we apply them to the cost as well. So, or the money that we receive from the trade-in, we apply that to the cost. So buying buses after New York State aid is applied is the best investment we can make. And so, you know, we recommend that we keep with this structure. And the 150, you see right here, the 150,000 miles, 145 miles, 144, 144, we found that between 120 and 140,000 miles is when buses start becoming more costly to maintain, and that's why we choose that number, around that number, to continually trade out old for new buses. So that's the last proposition, and that's the last recommendation we make for tonight. Now, this is an unprecedented year. You will not be coming to the school to vote. You will be taking your absentee ballot, you'll be filling it out, and you'll be returning it. And again, just to note, you have to have it returned by 5 p.m. on June 9th. So what happens if we have 49 yeses and 51 noes? So we would have to go to a contingency budget. And the biggest factor in a normal budget year, you have several options. The 2 options, A and B, are the ones that most school districts would go to. It's the easiest, and it's probably the least confusing to the community. You can either take the budget we proposed, change it, and go back out and ask again. Now, our budget starts July 1st. You typically have 30 days between the vote. Obviously, with a June 9 vote, there wouldn't be 30 days. We do not have any guidance from New York State regarding how a contingency budget vote, a second vote essentially, how that would be, addressed. So we're concerned that if we are defeated, we may have to go to the contingency budget. And what a contingency budget is, and I'll explain it. A contingency budget is where you cannot increase your tax levy amount from the previous year. So what does that mean? Last year in 1920, we received $24.3 million from the tax levy. In 2021, we're going to receive $24.8 million in tax levy, 1.94%. It's a difference of $473,000. That's that 1.94%. In a contingency budget, that would be eliminated, and our budget would then have to shrink. And so how would you shrink $473,000? There's a formula for that per New York State. So we would have to use this prescribed formula for making those reductions of $473,000. And as you can see, $42,000 out of administrative, over $300,000 in program, and then another $125,000 out of capital. If we were to do it through expenditure, if we used our reserves, we would have to use over $473,000 of reserves to make up that gap. And as I said earlier, that's not a formula that we are in position to do. So a defeated budget is going to force us to either have to try to get another vote approved if we can, or to make even further reductions. So, you know, this is a critical year to have our tax levy hopefully approved. So I know that that's a lot of information. I appreciate your patience. I'm assuming there's going to be some questions. Before we get to questions, though, I do want to put on here for all of you that you can go to our district website for all of this information. And you can certainly watch this again. It will be archived. And please send any questions you have to me or to our board clerk or our assistant superintendent, and we will gladly answer them. At that point, I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask for questions.
Hey, Jason, this
Yep.
is Greg. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey, can you explain, just for clarification, you know, why the BOCES increases are kind of out of our control?
Sure. So if you don't mind, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, so,
I'm going to get to that, just so it's up there on the board. So we provide, so we're talking special ed costs. Special ed costs, we have a continuum of services that we're supposed to provide every child, and so you start with the least restrictive environment, and then you build basically an individual education plan around student needs. So when a student enters our school district or has been part of our school district, but needs are beyond what we can provide within our buildings, we look to BOCES to provide alternatives from what we can provide. And so the BOCES special ed budget lines grow particularly because of high-need students and high-need programming that only BOCES can provide. So a student walks in the door, they transfer from another school district, and they have significant needs that we don't provide. We have to find a program for them. And so most, if not all of that cost is strictly a result of needing to put students in a program that BOCES provides that we don't.
and because BOCES is much larger, right, they have economies for providing those services that an individual district can't realize, correct?
Correct. Correct.
I guess the other one is the health insurance costs. There is a basic plan rate, right, that we pay for whatever the negotiated health insurance contract service or benefit is. But in addition to that, I think what's kind of out of our control is the fact that we, you know, when high claims come in, there's a modifier that we pay to spread them over 3 years as a result of the consortium. And, you know, I think if you look at, and this is just, again, it's something that you can't control and something that, you know, we provide as a benefit. But if somebody, you know, if there's high claims, that gets spread over 3 years and it gets added onto the cost of the basic, you know, whatever the basic plan is. And that also is somewhat out of our control. And I believe over the last several years, we either had the highest or the second highest modifier, which, you know, explains the growth that Maine-Endwell sees above and beyond some of the other districts. That modifier could actually be positive or negative, right? If I explain that right, I just wanted to elaborate on why sometimes that number grows, what seems to be, you know, beyond what the basic plan cost is, I guess.
Right, Greg, and another thing to just keep in mind too is that the basic medical inflationary changes year to year in the U.S. they range around 7 to 8%.
Right.
So if we had normal, high claims, year to year, and like you said, we've had some abnormally high ones the last 3 or 4 years, but even if we were looking at normal claims without any changes to what our benefits are, we're looking at 7%. So
Yeah.
when you look at 7% of 11 or 12 million, that's a big number. When you're looking at 11 or 12% because you have high claims, that's a harder number to look at. So
Right.
even if we return to kind of normalization of high claims in the next couple of years, we're still at 7 or 8% increases. That's kind of the norm in the
Right.
U.S. without making changes to
Right.
benefit structure. So
Right.
that's kind of the position we're in. In a good year, we'd probably be looking at, I mean, some of the consortium schools are 3 or 4%. They have no high claims experience, and they had a couple of good years of experience on normal claims. They might be at 2, 3, 4% increases. So yeah, so the consortium schools range all over the place from, low single digits to 12, 13, 14% increases if they're looking at high claims like we are.
Yeah, I think yeah, thank you, Jeff. I didn't mean to imply that we didn't have a normal increase anyway, but also correct, I mean, the other thing that I think is important to clarify is the group plan. It's not a group plan when we're in a consortium. We basically save on negotiated costs, right? Negotiations and administrative costs.
Yep.
But each district has their own plan.
Correct.
So-
We are a standalone plan within the consortium. Nobody else shares in our claims, pays for our claims.
Right.
Whatever we incur, we pay. Yep. So that's a
So
good.
it implies a group plan, right, where everybody pulls together and they come up with I'll see
Basic
some
rate for
leverage to negotiate with the healthcare provider. That really doesn't happen because every plan is dependent on whatever group you're negotiating the contract with. So,
Yep.
so it's not so easy to just say, let's change the plan or let's do something. And that's what Jason mentioned when he said we can't unilaterally change these things.
Right.
That's really what's behind all that. So.
No, and I think I mentioned last time, when we go to outside insurance companies or wherever we've been looking, just like you as a homeowner or somebody with auto insurance, the first thing that any insurance company is going to ask us for is 3 years of claims data. So when we turn over claims data that shows 10, 11, and $12 million per year of claims, that's what they're basing your premiums off of.
Right.
So, that's kind of the battle that we face, and like we said last time, being able to spread out high claims over a certain period of years is beneficial. However, we've had such a run of high claims that for us to leave the consortium today, we're looking at owing the consortium to pay off our high claims, basically. So we're constantly looking. It's kind of hard to package it's kind of hard to take 11 or $12 million of claims and go find a $9 million premium for them.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. I just wanted to clarify that those two line items, there's a lot of underlying, costs that are not really are not really controllable in 1 year, right? It
Right.
takes some time to renegotiate and find a plan that everybody agrees to and all that, so.
Correct.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to take away from any
No.
questions out from the public, but just wanted to clarify that for the public a little bit. Thanks.
There are any questions? If there are no questions, then, ladies and gentlemen of the board, if you are good with tonight's hearing, we will conclude our hearing and take a short break and then resume at 7 o'clock for our regular meeting.
Yep.
Okay,
Okay.
sounds good.
I'm
Sounds
fine.
good.
Thank you, Jason and Jeff.
Yep, thank you.
Okay,
Yes.
we'll see you in a few minutes.